Whenever I hear the bell, this isn't part of the sermon, but I'm reminded of that piece in It's a Wonderful Life, at the very end, when the bell rings and she says it's an angel gets its wings. So when I hear the bell, it's just sort of a reminder to me, not so much about angels, but just about coming into presence, right? It's just a good little reminder, because bells are used so often to call people into community, into presence. Well, good morning. I want to begin my talk with an introduction to my introduction. Giving the talk or sermon or message, however you like to think of this part of the service, the main feature, if you will, is unlike any other presentation I have given before. I don't mean the content of what I have to say, but the process of getting everything prepared for this morning. I sat down with Devorah a week ago Wednesday to go over the entire script and the planned music for today's service. And she told me that I could make changes in my talk right up to minutes before because of this marvelous feature called Google Docs. Yeah, anything I edit automatically appears on the script that Kate will scroll for me, Devorah said, just as Kate is doing at this very moment. All to say, I have had plenty of time to allow my early remarks to gestate, to critique, to edit. In doing so, I realized, as you will soon see, how autobiographical is my message today. And after feeling a bit sheepish about this realization, the thought occurred, well, perhaps this is not so bad, because none of you yet know much about me. And this way is a way to introduce myself to a bunch of you all at once. And maybe you will discover some commonality between us, or you will have sufficient reason to avoid me. And with that disclaimer, here is my real introduction. Norris, my wife, and I moved to Ajijic 6 years ago and became permanentes soon after arriving. I had this notion in my mind when I got here that I wasn't going to associate with the immigrant community, but rather connect with the local Mexican residents. This idea might have had some merit if I'd known how to speak and understand Spanish. Well, suffice it to say, I was lonely in those early years. My Spanish still hasn't gotten far beyond rudimentary greetings and the ability to do light commerce, but I now have successfully put away the idea that I would remain aloof from people with the same skin tone as mine and the north of the border origin. In those early years at Lakeside, I didn't even attend Sunday services, which, considering I am or was a cradle Christian and a lifelong member of one church or another, not to mention being an ordained Protestant minister, was highly unusual for me. This self-imposed exile came to an end when I was invited to go back to Sonoma, California, where my wife and I came from and where I had lived for the past 35 years, invited to fill in for the pastor of my home church while she was on sabbatical. This was during the summer of 2022. And when I got there and began my pastoral ministry, I became aware of how starved for meaningful connection I had been here in Mexico. During my nearly 5-month tenure there, I resolved that when I got back to Ajijic, I would find a church home and connect with people of like mind and heart. So here I am. Having been a regular attendee on these past Sundays for over a year now, and also connecting with a couple of men's groups and a stretch and balance class that I attend regularly on the plaza, not to mention my weekly tennis games with one of my fellow members present here today. Insofar as the mores and tenets of LCUUF are concerned, they are a far stretch from my formative religious associations. But in truth, it has always been the relationships that I have formed in various churches and denominations that have been the most important aspect of my church affiliations, not the particular belief systems. And such it is here as I slowly get to know more of you in this unfolding connection, such as making this presentation today. I began my talk with a partial introduction, well, actually two introductions, of me to you, thinking that this may help deepen the connection I have sought to make here poco a poco. With that, let's talk about the power of connection. #1 New York Times bestselling author Brené Brown writes that connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. When they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. Let me read this quote again. Connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. Brown, with an earned doctorate in social worker, went on to say in her book, Atlas of the Heart, that connection is in our neurobiology. This is why our experiences of disconnection are so painful, and why chronic disconnection leads to social isolation, loneliness, and feelings of powerlessness. In my case, the experience of disconnection in my first years here led exactly to what Brown said: social isolation, loneliness, and feelings of powerlessness, and especially for me, a loss of meaning and powerlessness. I came to see that my life, up to the point of moving to Mexico, had been filled with relationships and belonging to one group or another. For example, I was part of a weekly ecumenical clergy group for over 30 years in Sonoma. We met each week for 2 hours, discussing things that were going on in our congregations, in our marriages, and in our personal lives. You can imagine how important that group became for me and what a loss it was when I left that constant source of deep fellowship 6 years ago. In retrospect, I believe I was born to develop close connections with others. I grew up in a family with 8 siblings in a 3-bedroom farmhouse, one belonging to my parents, of course, and the other 2 bedrooms split between my 4 sisters and my 4 brothers and me. Oh, and just 1 bathroom for the 11 of us. Then my family was very much connected to our local church, where apart from home and school, we spent much of our time, including youth group, choir, and midweek indoctrination classes, formerly known as catechism. You might say I was fated to be in community with others, spiritual community, that is, which makes my early decision in Mexico to remain aloof from spiritually minded people with whom I could actually communicate, one of the craziest schemes I ever came up with. Wow. Having made the decision to reconnect with a faith community, this faith community has begun to restore my sense of purpose and meaning. I believe that I'm on this earth to be the best version of myself that I can be, and to help others, encourage others to be the best version of themselves. Now, for this goal to be accomplished, two things are required. The first is obvious. I have to be connected with others, as I have been discussing here. The second may not be quite as obvious. I also need to be connected with myself. Connected with myself. I wonder if this makes sense to you. I think of this as really knowing myself, my motives, my deceits, my proclivities, my shadow side, my delights, my hopes and fears, and so on. And not just knowing these things, but embracing them. Both the positive aspects of myself and what I consider to be the negative aspects of who I am and how it is that I show up. As Norris can attest, I am by no means a steady practitioner of the habits of mind that may bring this self-knowledge to fruition. But embracing even my backsliding capabilities is part of the deal. And I am growing in my curiosity about and my appreciation of all the parts of me, both the positive and the not so positive. You see, if I don't embrace the full package of my own thoughts and behaviors, my various moods and emotions, how can I expect to foster close relationships with others who, well, let's face it, none of us are without our character and personality defects to one degree or another. And if I turn away from that which I find annoying in myself, and there's plenty of that, I should add, how can I expect to connect with others? Others who, like me, are imperfect people. Now, back to my boyhood for a moment. I grew up in a restrictive religious environment. However, I didn't know at the time that pious Calvinistic Christianity wasn't the top drawer of religious aspiration and practice. After all, the western Michigan of the Holland Grand Rapids area where I lived was saturated with pious Dutch Reformed and Christian Reformed congregations, all nurtured, or should I say tortured, with an unshakable belief in the total depravity of man. And it was man back in the day. Most of my public school classmates attended one of these churches. The culture was permeated by a narrow religious impulse. No dancing allowed in our school, for example, because, of course, of what it might lead to. All our righteousness is as filthy rags, my mother used to quote regularly. But once I left home for college and began to experience the secular university dorm life, well, I experienced depravity in living color. And dang if I didn't grow to really like the practitioners of this very unchurch-like behavior. Yes. Individually, they didn't seem so bad to me, and I was actually jealous of their freedom to just behave however they wanted. I did try unsuccessfully to save their souls, however. That was a long time ago. You can perhaps appreciate why, as I moved to liberal Northern California to begin my work as an ordained minister, I felt obliged to remake the image of myself, or in terms of this discussion this morning, to make a new connection with myself, not as a fallen and depraved human being in need of saving, but rather as with each of you, a being that at the very heart of who I am, and again of who you are, exists peace, love, and joy. Why do I know this to be true about myself and about you too? Because these are the very qualities, peace, love, joy, and similar, which I feel drawn to in others. Being with those who, as Brené Brown said in our opening quote, practice hearing and seeing and valuing each other. These values and practices are what make meaningful connection happen. And it is these kinds of connections that I believe bring out the best in ourselves and in others. Now, there is another way, what we believe, beyond what we believe, to be true about ourselves, I think that is important in terms of connecting with ourselves and with others. And this is the quality of being comfortable in our own skin, being at home within ourselves. And Kate, I'm going to pause for just a moment here and digress. The first time I became aware of this being comfortable in one's own skin, I was actually in this congregation back in Sonoma, and we had an interim minister come in. And as I watched him Sunday after Sunday behind the pulpit, as we called it, I just observed that this man was just so at home within himself. And it just struck something in me so deep. And it was almost like one of those aha experiences where you just feel like you can be totally present with that person and mutual. And he was his presence in my life for just a year was a large reason for why I became sort of reordained in the United Church of Christ, away from my previous denomination, which I described earlier. Anyway, so being at home in the body. In a talk by Buddhist teacher Joseph Goldstein, one of the co-founders of the Insight Meditation Center in Boeve, Massachusetts, he shared a quote from James Joyce, who wrote of one of his characters, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. Then Goldstein said, we're all a Mr. Duffy very often, and that our mind is often a bit ahead of itself. Now, whether this describes your own experience and you are even aware of this way of being with yourself, here's the teaching. Can we settle back and be present to what is arising just in this moment? Whatever that may be perceived as positive, whether that may be perceived as positive or negative, attractive or repulsive, amusing or alarming, and so on. Just being present to what is. One of the things that attracted me to this fellowship is the emphasis that is placed from time to time on meditation, or simply being still and present in the moment. It is in these moments of stillness when we have the best opportunity to connect with ourselves, to watch our thoughts, and to observe what our minds tend to focus on. In my own case, I have observed that I tend, not surprisingly, given my Calvinistic background, my thoughts tend towards negative frames of reference, with slight worries creeping into my consciousness unbidden. I don't favor this way of being. I mean, who wouldn't prefer to be a positive thinking individual a la Norman Vincent Peale? But instead, I continue to find truck with the adage that negative thinking is like Velcro and positive thinking like Teflon. Here's what is changing for me, however. I am now just beginning at this stage in my life to look at my tendencies with curiosity instead of self-judgment, and to simply be with whatever arises. And maybe when I'm really present, inquiring, a la Ramana Maharshi, inquiring, why is this thought arising in this moment? Why am I feeling anxious or happy or bored? And this discovery of being inquisitive and curious instead of judging myself brings me back to how we connect with each other. What if instead of fixing each other in place with our judgments and perhaps criticisms, what if we practice curiosity and wonder and, of course, acceptance of one another? We are all more alike than we are different. We want to be like, we want to live as fully as possible. We want to be seen by others and be respected. In short, we want to be loving. We want to be loved, and we want to be loving towards others as best we know how. Isn't that right? This is what makes real connection happen. And when these connections deepen, such as in a fellowship like ours, therein lies soul-enhancing vitality and transforming power. So may it be, and amen.